Welcome everyone to Journey Through the Books of the Prophets. We are in the second book of Kings, and we just finished last week the story of Chizkiyahu HaMelech. Chizkiyahu HaMelech, as we discussed, was one of the greatest kings of Israel, and his story in a certain way ended last week. But I was doing a more of an in-depth study of who he was and what he accomplished, and got through a good part of it, but there was one part left that I want to start the class tonight with before we move on. So before this last piece, just to be clear that he also was one of the greatest builders in Jerusalem in the ancient times, is that he was responsible for building what's called the Broad Wall, which they have unearthed in our time. And it was a wall to protect the city. And also he was responsible for bringing water into Jerusalem through the Siloam tunnel and the Gihon stream, also known as the Mei HaShiloach. And that is still seen in the city of David. It's become a world attraction, what they have unearthed there, all the way back to not only to first temple times, all the way back to David. And so Chizkiyahu HaMelech, he was responsible for really strengthening Jerusalem. And of course, the great miracle that we discussed last time, when Sancheriv surrounded the city, and everyone woke up in the morning, and 185,000 Assyrian soldiers were dead on the ground. It is a mystery exactly what happened. In the text, it's an angel of God struck them. It was some kind of plague, sickness, whatever it was, but Chizkiyahu, he was king at the time, and we discussed all of this. Now, the last piece, though, is coming from the Gemara in Sanhedrin, and it's a very important piece about Chizkiyahu HaMelech. So it starts. We should know that the 11th chapter of Sanhedrin is one of the longest stretches of what we call a Gadata in the entire Talmud. A Gadata are the stories, the parables, the allegories. But in this particular chapter, it's the entire tradition that the sages had about Mashiach, Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, and the world to come. And it's all in around 20 pages. 20 pages doesn't sound a lot, but 20 pages of Gemara, people spend lifetime learning these 20 pages. So anyone who gets Safaria, it's on 99a. There's a piece about Chizkiyahu. So here they're discussing, we're only taking a little segment out of this. Second. And it starts like this. They're discussing how long is the Messianic era going to last. And so Rabbi Eliezer says 40 years. That will be the length of the Messianic era. And we'll see there are three different opinions that are brought here. And each one brings a verse in order to try to prove it. So just because of a certain amount of time, I won't go into the verses, but the first opinion is the Messianic era will last for 40 years. The second opinion is from Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and he said 70 years. 70 years will be the length of the Messianic era. And the third opinion by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is that it will last for 3 generations. Now the question is, well, what comes after that? So this is, again, a part of a much longer discussion, but here we have what's called the resurrection of the dead, the world to come. But there are many different opinions of how long this process will take. So I have a book, I'll just show everyone. It's called When Mashiach Comes. This is the book. And it's all about different traditions about Mashiach. So one of the ideas that the Rambam gives over, the last 2 chapters of Rambam's classic work, the Mishnah Torah, is from the Laws of Kings. And since Mashiach is considered a king, Melech HaMashiach, we envision him as being an authority like a king, an actual king. So the last 2 chapters is Rambam's, Maimonides' vision or perspective of Mashiach. And it's very well quoted, but it's not exclusive, because one of the things he says is that we have an unbroken tradition that there will be a Redeemer who we will call Mashiach. But just like Moshe redeemed us from Egypt, there will be a Redeemer at the end of days, but it won't be just for Israel. It will be for the entire world, and the entire world will move into a different era altogether, what we call the Messianic era. But one of the things he says is, because in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, there are many, many different traditions about Mashiach. And so he says, even though we have this unbroken tradition that Mashiach will come, we won't know until he comes exactly who it will be, how it will be played out, how long the Messianic era will take, and all of the details. And he says, we'll have to wait until we get there. So here in the Gemara, there are 3 traditions, 40 years, 70 years, and 3 generations. But in this book that I showed you, When Mashiach Comes, by Yehuda Chayun, he brings other traditions that are brought in other places other than the Talmud, in the Midrash. And so along with these 3, there are opinions that the Messianic era will last for 365 years. Some say 400 years. Another one is 2,000 years. Another opinion is the amount of time from the time that God promised Noah there would never be another flood until Mashiach comes. That time period will be reproduced, as it were, as the length of the Messianic era. Another opinion is from creation till Mashiach. That will be how long the Messianic era will end. And another one is 7,000 years. And another one is 365,000 years. Now here he doesn't bring the exact sources for all of these, but We assume that he, of course, got these from different midrashim. So it's like Maimonides said, until it happens, we won't know. Okay, so now you might ask, well, why am I bringing all this? Because this was, I said it was going to be about Chizkiyahu, HaMelech. So that comes for the next opinion. Rabbi Hillel Omer, this is not the same as the famous Hillel. He was one of the sons of Yehuda Nasi. So he says like this, Ein lehem Mashiach liYisrael, shekvar achluhu b'yamei Chizkiyahu. So he makes an amazing statement. He says, there will not be a messianic figure in the future because Israel already enjoyed the Messianic era at the time of Chizkiyahu HaMelech. So this is, again, like an astounding statement. Question is, what does he mean here? As we've discussed, the text itself says Chizkiyahu was the greatest of the kings. One verse almost implies he was greater than David. And another verse equal or maybe not quite as great as David, but in the same league of importance. And last week we discussed that the miracle that happened in the time of Chizkiyahu, even though a lot of people, don't even know about it, it's not included in our prayers, it's not something that is mentioned that often, but in the context of Jewish history, as we discussed, it really was one of the greatest miracles, is because Assyria had already exiled the 10 tribes. There was no more northern kingdom, only really the tribe of Yehuda, Binyamin. I think David pointed out that Shimon was part of the tribe of the inheritance of Yehuda. There were the Kohanim and Leviim, but there were very few of them left. And a smattering of those who escaped from the northern kingdom. But these 185,000 troops were literally about to take Jerusalem and end the southern kingdom. And if that would have happened, it's not clear at all that the Jewish people would have been able to survive. It was that existential. And so when the miracle happened, this we can understand what Reb Hillel was saying. Is that we already had the redemption at the time of Chizkiyahu. So how do the sages take this statement from Reb Hillel? So Rav Yosef says, basically, Hashem should forgive him for saying such a thing. In other words, it was like, what are you talking about? How can you say there will be no Mashiach when we look through the books of the prophets and it's full of prophecies of a future Redeemer and a Messianic era? So it's explained like this. It's not that Reb Hillel didn't believe that there would be a redemption at the end of days, but he felt that it would be God alone who would do it. And I believe we mentioned this before, at the burning bush, when God, as it were, was trying to convince Moshe to take on the mantle of leadership. So Moshe had all kinds of arguments. One of the arguments that he had, not in the text, but in the commentaries, was, God, it's clear you're going to be the one taking Israel out of Egypt. You're going to be doing the 10 plagues. You're going to be performing the miracles. What do you need me for? What do you need me for? You can do it yourself. Another explanation is Moshe was saying that if you want me to do this, then this has to be the final redemption. This, in other words, as it were, make me Mashiach, that we don't have to go through this for thousands of years. If there's going to be a redemption, let it be now. And in fact, when Moshe said, when I go back and they ask me, who sent you? Who should I tell them sent me? And God mentioned a name that's never mentioned again in the Tanakh, is Ekia Asher Ekia. I will be that I will be. And Rashi explains, what does this name mean? Of course, it means many things, but one of the things it means is, I will be with you in this exile, like I will be with you in future exiles. And so, according to Rashi, and this is a tradition, that Moshe said to him, it's not enough that they're going through what they're going through now. I have to tell them that there'll be future exiles, that you'll be with us. And then in the text, God changes it and just says, tell them Ekia sent you. I will be. And so Moshe was saying, let it be Mashiach. Either you do it or make me Mashiach. And so one of the explanations that Reb Hillel, when he said there will not be a Mashiach in the future because Israel already enjoyed this redemption. And so it's not that he didn't believe that there would be a future redemption, but he felt that God would do it himself. And so even though Reb Yosef said, God should forgive you for saying this, it's not like Reb Hillel didn't believe in a final redemption. It's just he felt God will do it. We already had such a figure in Chizkiyahu. And so when we look at the book of Isaiah, we learned last week, and we're going to learn more about Isaiah, either this week or next week, is that in the end, Chizkiyahu married Isaiah's daughter. And that's where we're going to pick up the story now, is Menashe was the eldest son of Chizkiyahu, and he took over. And that's where we're going to pick up the story right now. But there is another tradition that Chizkiyahu in his generation was worthy to be Mashiach. We have this tradition that in every generation, there is an individual who, if the generation would merit, so he could be the Mashiach. And so this is part of what Reb Hillel was talking about, that he was worthy to being Mashiach. But the tradition is that he comes from David HaMelech. He's the 13th king in the lineage of David HaMelech. And of course, David HaMelech was called Na'im Zmirot Yisrael, the pleasant singer of Israel. Na'im Zmirot Yisrael. And so it's given over that, well, why wasn't Chizkiyahu the full Mashiach? Not just a potential Mashiach or a possible Mashiach. And they answered, because he didn't sing song. In other words, after this incredible miracle, he did not sing, compose, create a song that would thank God for it. We know that after we crossed the Red Sea and tremendous miracle, that Moshe and all of Israel sang a song. And Devorah, after a great victory over Sisera, so she sang a song. And Hannah, after she finally had a child, Shmuel, so she sang a song. So the idea was that somehow Chizkiyahu, I think it's more of like a metaphor. He didn't sing song, is that perhaps he didn't fully express his appreciation for what had happened. And so here we see that by tradition, this is why he didn't become the full Mashiach. Okay, so now we're continuing with chapter 21. Everyone should know that we are getting fairly close to the end of the second book of Kings. We have maybe a week or two left. So in chapter 21, so it says that when Chizkiyahu died, his son Menashe became king. He was 12 years old, similar to Shlomo HaMelech, when he became king, and he ruled for 55 years. So in the first book of Kings and the second book of Kings, he ruled longer than any of the kings of Israel. 55 years. And it mentions his mother's name, which means it was the wife of Chizkiyahu, and that's Hephzibah. My desire is in her. Meaning, in a certain way, God's desire is in Am Yisrael. And the first thing it says, he did evil in the eyes of God. It's a verse that we've seen over and over and over again with the evil kings of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And then it goes into a long description of all the different idol worship that he reintroduced. Remember, Chizkiyahu's father, Achaz, also was an idol worshiper and did evil in God's eyes. And Chizkiyahu turned everything around, brought Torah back, remember, brought Pesach back, got rid of all of the idols, and built Yerushalayim. And now his son comes and he goes back and reverses everything that Chizkiyahu did. It explains in great deal all the different types of idol worship. He even had his son pass through the fire of one of these idol worships called Moloch. In the Torah, it mentions that a number of times. It was considered one of the worst things. It was child sacrifice and making children pass through the fire. And in response, remember, we're getting towards the destruction of the temple. It will not happen for a while, but already the writing is on the wall. And so God says that it's like too much, too much. And God is already saying that exile and destruction are coming. Too much evil, and it cannot be passed over. And then in the 16th verse, it says, along with everything that he did, it says that Menashe shed very much innocent blood, till he had filled Yerushalayim from one end to the other with blood. And in Hebrew, what's interesting is from one end to the other is peh lepeh, from mouth to mouth. So the question is, what does that mean? So we do know from history that Menashe, he was like Achav. He was killing off the prophets, because as this is happening, we can imagine that the prophets are railing against the evil that Menashe is doing. And so Menashe is killing off the prophets. And what we're going to learn in a few minutes is the most important prophet that he killed was his own grandfather, Isaiah, Yeshayahu. And we're going to learn the story in more depth in a few minutes. And so after, actually, it's just in less than a chapter, these 55 years, just all the evil that he did, all the blood that he shed. And then it just says that all of the acts of Menashe, they are written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Yehuda, and he slept with his fathers. But it says he was buried in the garden of his own house. Almost all the other ones, even some of the evil ones, they were buried in the city of David, along with the other kings. Here it says he was buried alone in his own house. And it just says he dies, and his son, Ammon, takes over, and he only ruled for 2 years. And as we learned many times, his servants or people surrounding him assassinated him after only 2 years. And the people of Israel found the people who had killed Ammon, and they executed them. And Ammon's son, Yeshayahu, then became king. So for right now, we're going to leave Yeshayahu, because he is a very, very important figure in the book of Kings and in Jewish history. And here we have to go now to the book of Chronicles. I mentioned before that the book of Chronicles has a lot of information that the book of Kings doesn't have. It's not completely clear why certain stories, in fact, I think it was last week when we learned about Chizkiyahu reestablishing the holiday of Pesach. And we learned that it's not mentioned in the book of Kings, but it's mentioned extensively in the book of Chronicles. And it's mentioned in the Gemara that Chizkiyahu did such a thing. So why certain things are mentioned in the book of Kings and some are left out and only recorded later? Some of them aren't recorded either and are just oral traditions that we find in the Midrash or in the Talmud. But for the story of Menashe, it's the 33rd chapter of the second book of Chronicles. And it begins almost, not word by word, but just that he did evil, reintroduced idol worship, did terrible things. But interesting, it says that Hashem spoke to Menashe and to the people, but they didn't hear. So it appears that at some point, God communicated somehow, could have been in a dream or a daydream, with Menashe, letting him know that what he was doing was not acceptable. And it says that he didn't listen, and the people also didn't pick up how dissatisfied God was with the situation. And then what it says is that, now remember, the king of Assyria had taken away, or Syria had taken away the 10 tribes. They tried to conquer Yehuda, but they didn't. After the 185,000 soldiers died, Sancheriv left Israel, went back, but nonetheless, the empire of Assyria was still very vast. And so Israel was more or less like a vassal state. They didn't conquer it, they didn't exile the southern tribes, but they were still like a huge presence. So at one point, the king of Assyria came and he took Menashe and he brought him in chains to Assyria. When that happened, and this is recorded in the second book of Chronicles, that this whole episode obviously was very humbling for Menashe. He was king of Yehuda, now he's taken to Assyrian chains because it's not clear what he did wrong that the king of Assyria was upset with him. But he was brought there and he was humbled. And it says, and he prayed to God, and God received his teshuvah. And he was brought back to Jerusalem. Whatever he had upset the king with, the king let him go, and he came back to Israel. And now it says that he actually did teshuvah, and it says specifically, "V'yada Menashe ki Hashem hu ha'elokim." That Menashe accepted, acknowledged that God is king. God is the sovereign God of the universe. And it says that he started to rebuild Yerushalayim, and he took away the idol worship, and he took away an altar he had made in the temple, and he commanded Am Yisrael to serve only God. And so it appears he did complete teshuvah, not like theoretic. He changed his ways, and he reinstituted many of the things that his father had done. And then it just ends that all of his deeds were written in the book of Kings of Israel, and also his prayer and how it was accepted, and all of his sins that he did before he humbled himself before God. And then it just says that he died and he was buried in his own place. So this is a very, very important part of the story of Menashe, because here it's very rare, it's almost unique that of all these evil kings of the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, here Menashe does teshuvah, but he acts out his teshuvah. Nonetheless, perhaps next week, that I myself have to do more research, but in the Gemara, the same Gemara that we were talking about, Mashiach and Chizkiyahu and all of the traditions of Techiyat HaMeitim and the world to come. So he is one of the kings. There are three kings, Achav, Achaz, and Menashe, that are considered not to have a place in the world to come because of all the evil that they did. And so, Li Neder, we will try to find an answer. If he did Teshuvah, then why do the sages still treat him as being an evil king? Now, it's true, for most of his kingship, he did terrible things. As we're about to learn about his own grandfather, he killed. Isaiah, who we had learned is considered, next to Moshe, perhaps the greatest of all of the prophets. In fact, most of the commentaries state that openly, that he was second only to Moshe in prophecy. So now we're going to go back and we're going to learn just a very, very interesting story in the Gemara about the whole story with Menashe and Yeshayahu, his grandfather Isaiah. And I'll remind everyone, last week we learned that Chizkiyahu became ill. And he was literally on his deathbed. And God came to Isaiah and said, prepare yourself and your family, because you will not recover, you're going to die. And Chizkiyahu, it says he turned his face to the wall and he prayed. Isaiah had left already. I'm not sure if I said this the first time. If not, I'm adding it now. That when Yeshayahu told him that you will not live, you will die. So Chizkiyahu said to him, I don't accept what you're saying. I have a tradition going back to David HaMelech that even if the sword is on your neck, one should not stop asking for compassion. In other words, don't ever give up. Like Rabbi Nachman says, Ein Yeush ba'olam. There is no such thing as giving up hope. And then it says he turned his face to the wall and he prayed. Isaiah had left already, and God came back to him and said, go back to Chizkiyahu and tell him that 15 years has been added to his life. We'll see how that plays itself out in a few minutes here. But we learned the inside story of the idea that Chizkiyahu had not married. And Yeshayahu was very down on him. And he said, I'm afraid to marry because I have a clear prophetic vision that my son will be very evil. Therefore, I don't want to marry and I don't want to give birth to an evil son. Now, in a certain way, that makes perfect sense. He had a clear prophetic vision. But Yeshayahu, we discussed this in great length. It's very paradoxical and mysterious. But he said to him, you have a mitzvah to do called be fruitful and multiply. And you have a mitzvah to get married and have children. And you have to do your best to raise your children the best that you can. You can't trust in this prophetic vision as a reason for you not to do these mitzvot. So Yeshayahu married the daughter of Isaiah, and sure enough, he had Menashe. So his vision was correct. And that we discussed last week. So now, having said that, the Gemara says like this. And this is on the verse that Menashe had spilled much blood in Jerusalem from peh el peh, literally from mouth to mouth, but it means from one side of the city to the other. But now we're going to understand why mouth to mouth. So Menashe, okay, so it says like this. We shouldn't make a mistake. This Gemara that I'm going to give over to you now shows that Menashe was a student of Torah, which made his first years all that much more evil. He knew the Torah, and so he wanted to judge Isaiah as being a false prophet. And he said to him, "You did 3 things that are contrary to the Torah. Therefore, you are not a legitimate prophet, and you're actually a false prophet, and you need to be executed." So what was the first thing? So in the Torah, God says to Moshe, "No one can see my face and live." And in the book of Isaiah, so it says that he saw God sitting on his throne. In the 6th chapter of Isaiah, he saw God sitting on his throne. So Menashe said to him, you're contradicting. How can you say you saw God when even Moshe couldn't see God? The second thing was that you came back to Chizkiyahu and said God will add 15 years to your life. But it says in the Torah that God fills a person's life, meaning it's decreed before a person even comes to this world how long they're going to live. There is no such thing as adding years to a person's life. A person could be taken out of the world earlier, but not added. And you're saying that you said in God's name that he's going to add 15 years to Chizkiyahu's life. That was the second one. Isaiah says to himself, whatever I try to say to him, however I try to defend myself, he's not going to listen. It's clear that just like he's killed the other prophets, he's going to kill me also. And if I answer him, now remember, it's his grandson. If I answer him and he still executes me, it will be like he's doing it from a place of knowledge. If I don't answer him, he has the excuse that he was, in the end, he was mistaken. But once I correct him, so he'll have no excuse. So the Gemara says that he said a name of God, and he disappeared, and he was transported into a cedar tree, into the trunk of a cedar tree. But again, Menashe was actually on a very, very high level. And so he somehow found out or understood where he had escaped to. And he sent his soldiers, and they cut the tree in half. And Isaiah was in the tree. And it says that when the saw got to where Isaiah was hiding, it got to his mouth, he died. And they say, why did he die? It's because in the 6th chapter, when God, kind of like Moshe, actually not in the 6th chapter, before that, when God appears to Yeshayahu and says, you will be a prophet. So Isaiah said, I am of impure lips, and I am among a people of impure lips. So it's explained that Isaiah didn't have to add that second part. In other words, if he felt he wasn't worthy to be a prophet, then, okay, he should say, I'm not on the level, I'm of impure lips. But then he added, among a people that are of impure lips. In other words, we'll call it Lashon Hara. He was saying evil speech about the people of Israel. Now, most likely what he was saying was partly true, but nonetheless, we learn a great lesson from this. And I'll say that in a minute. That's why when the saw came to his mouth, he died. And that's why the original verse says that Menashe spilled blood from mouth to mouth, because it's hinting to Isaiah. Okay, so here comes the second thing that Yeshayahu said. Remember, Menashe accused him of being a false prophet because of 3 contradictions that he said. The first one, as we said, was, you claim you saw God. Even Moshe, God said, no one could see my face and live. And the third one was about adding 15 years to the life of Chizkiyahu. The second one was, Yeshayahu says, Dirshu Hashem v'himatzo. Seek out God when he can be found. And in the Torah, it says, that Hashem, like, who is a great nation that has a God who is close and who listens to his people whenever they call. So Menashe said to Yeshayahu, you're implying that God is not available all the time. He is only available some of the time. And it says in the Torah that God listens to his people whenever they call him. So those were the 3 reasons. And then we discussed how Yeshayahu died. So then the Gemara goes on and says, okay, well, what about these 3 contradictions? How do we solve them? In other words, again, Menashe was on a very high level of learning, and that made his evil deeds all the worse. So the first one was, God said to Moshe, no one could see my face and live. And Yeshayahu, it says that he saw God sitting on his throne. So it's explained that Moshe sees to what's called an aspaklaria ha'me'ira, a clear glass, clear pane. In other words, he sees God directly. And because of that, because he could see so directly, he is told, no one can see my face and live, even Moshe. Yeshayahu, even though he's the second greatest prophet, all of the other prophets except for Moshe saw through what's called an aspaklaria lo me'ira, a non-clear pane or glass. And so when Yeshayahu says, I saw God sitting on his throne, it's understood that he wasn't seeing a clear vision the essence of God. He was seeing it through a unclear pane. So therefore, it's not really a contradiction. The second one was, is God available all the time, like the Torah implies? God is available all the time. He might not grant us what we're praying for, but God does hear everything, and every prayer is accounted for. And so here the Gemara explains that the verse in the Torah is talking about a community. When a community turns to God in prayer, again, it doesn't mean that the community will always get what it's praying for. But God is, as it were, available. Yeshayahu is talking about an individual. And so then the question is, well, what does that mean? When is God found? Now, again, we have to understand this. It's a very subtle thing. Of course, God is always available. God hears everything. We can turn to God at any time. But there are degrees, just like there are degrees between Moshe and Yeshayahu of seeing God. There's degrees, I'll say, as it were, of God's availability. Just like God is everywhere, but we say God is more concentrated in the land of Israel, in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. It's a matter of degrees. So the Gemara says an amazing thing, and this is really part of our prayers. So it says, so then when is the most auspicious time that God is available for the individual? So they say between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. This is what we call Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of Teshuvah. That is when God is most available. Even in the month of Elul, we have this idea that HaMelech b'sadeh, that God comes out of his castle, out of where the kingdom is the palace, and he goes out to the field where he's available for everyone. So that's a parable of in Elul, and especially the 10 days of Teshuvah, where God is more available. It's the same thing we'll say about Shabbat. A person can have peace of mind anytime. It's not exclusive to Shabbat, but Shabbat is the most auspicious time to get into that headspace, into that consciousness of peace of mind. So again, we're talking about degrees here. And then we come to the last so-called contradiction. Can a person have years added to his life or not? And so here there's a debate actually between Rabbi Akiva and the sages. Rabbi Akiva says that a person comes into this world and it's already been established how long they will live. A person might live less, or, as we'll see in the case of Chizkiyahu, he was going to live for a certain amount of time, and then it seemed like he was going to die earlier. But Rabbi Akiva is explaining that when God said, I'll add 15 years to his life, it was because Chizkiyahu was going to die early for something that he had done wrong. But now he was going to live out his full years by getting those extra 15. And the sages didn't agree with Rabbi Akiva. They were that in principle, that 15 years could be added to someone's life. It wasn't written in stone how long a person is going to live before they come into this world. So it's a disagreement. So here we see some very, very interesting things. And we've mentioned it before, is there's a string of evil kings who give birth to righteous kings. And then there's a whole string of righteous kings who give birth to evil kings. And so, let's say in the modern debate between nature and nurture, there's no guarantees in this world. Someone could be very righteous and do their utmost to bring up their children in a certain way, but there's absolutely no guarantee that the children, for 100 different reasons or factors that are beyond the parents' control, go in a different direction. Or the opposite. You can have an evil king who, like Chizkiyahu, because his father was evil, and he only started to reign when he was in his late 20s. So he lived through his father's kingdom of idol worship. And yet, he turned around completely. We can go back to the first Jew, Avram Avinu. His father was an idol worshiper. He sold idols. And Avram turned completely 180 degrees in a different direction. So it's just quite interesting that we're getting towards the end of the book of Kings, the second book of Kings. And we can see that there's this pattern that can't be predicted. It cannot be predicted, and that applies to every one of us also, that we do our best, and then there's certain factors that are out of our control. That's one of the things that Rabbi Akiva was saying, was that even how long we're going to live is not completely in our hands. It's obviously not in our hands. But here, Rabbi Akiva was saying a person comes in the world and each person has their time period. And this is where we could put in from the idea of reincarnation, that we come into this world with a certain amount of baggage. But that baggage may include, at least in Rabbi Akiva's eyes, how long we're going to live. But it doesn't determine how we're going to live. So in other words, a person in a previous lifetime could have been very evil, and he's sent back to this world. But that doesn't mean that that baggage will determine that he'll be evil in this world also. Because we have free will at all times, even if we have a lot of baggage. That's one of the mysteries of reincarnation, is that we all have this baggage when we come into this world, but it doesn't determine how we're going to deal with this world this time. We have the opportunity. That's why we were sent back, is to try to fix it. Even though sometimes it appears as a punishment, it's actually God's chesed. As we've learned, the word for reincarnation in Hebrew, Gilgul, equals 72, equals chesed, God's loving kindness. He's giving us another chance. So with this class, we finished with Chizkiyahu and with Menashe. And as I said, we have probably one or two more weeks of this series till we finish the second book of Kings.